Greetings from Texas. I welcome you all to first FinFest USA virtual lecture in this year. Those who participated last year and now the new audience members, please be sure that you register for all the events for 2022. The 2021 registrations have expired, so you need to go back and re-register and just click all. I register for all panels, all events, and that way you will get the information throughout the year. My name is Helena Halmari. I am your host, and thank you for joining us. In January, FinFest USA, in partnership with Minnesota Orchestra and also Sam Houston State University, brings you two virtual lectures that form a continuation for the wonderful celebration during the past few weeks of Jean Sibelius and the Minnesota Orchestra's long-term director, Osmo Vansk. The two FinFest January lectures continue the Sibelius theme. Today's presenter will soon be introduced, and next Saturday on January 29th, FinFest will bring the second presenter from Sibelius Academy and the National Library of Finland, the editor-in-chief of the impressive and massive Sibelius project, Dr. Timo Virtanen. His presentation is entitled The Genesis of the Two Versions of Jean Sibelius's Violin Concerto. Those of you who attended the Minnesota Orchestra performances will see a connection to FinFest's program offering. For February, FinFest USA will shift gears. The theme of the two events next month will be the multilingual Finland. These will be panels with short presentations, more presenters, but shorter presentations. We will take about the same time as we have been taking with one bigger lecture, so about an hour plus is the time frame. So the panel introductions will be short, and then we will also have a question and answer to the panelists. So the first panel will take place on February 19th, and the topics will be Finnish and Finland Swedish. A week after that, on February 26th, we will hear presentations on minority and migrant languages in Finland today. We are again bringing together scholars who have worked on these various languages spoken in Finland, and these promise to be interesting and informing panels. Please stay tuned for details and make sure you're registered for 2022. Your donations make it possible for FinFest to continue to offer these virtual events, and they will make it also possible to plan for a future FinFest that is not virtual. You can donate just with the click of a button, and all donations will be received with gratitude. For a nonprofit organization, your support is essential. As always, this event too is recorded live, and the recording will be available sometime next week on FinFest USA's website. This is a webinar which allows a larger audience. This means that you will not be able to see yourself or other participants. However, you can communicate with the host via the chat function if there are any technical non-question comments. But please use the question and answer function, which is also at the bottom of your screen, to ask questions. Dr. Karl Rahkonen, the moderator, will function in that role and will present your questions to our speaker, Professor Grimley, after the lecture. And now let me introduce our moderator, Dr. Karl Rahkonen, who will then introduce today's speaker. Dr. Rahkonen is a familiar face in FinFest USA events, and many of you already know him. For instance, he was the presenter in December's virtual event. Karl Rahkonen retired recently as professor and music librarian at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. He often contributes lively interactive talks at FinFest USA festivals, as well as performing violin and fiddle in orchestras and bands. And these events have come to define the FinFest festivals. He spent the year 2017 on a sabbatical studying Finnish-American music in several archival collections in the USA and Finland. And his current writing project is a book with the working title, The Finnish-American Musical Journey. Dr. Rahkonen, thank you for joining us today to moderate our event and to introduce our main speaker, our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is truly my great honor to introduce to you Professor Daniel M. Grimley. He is a professor of music at the University of Oxford, Douglas Algar Tutorial Fellow at in Music at Merton College, and Head of Humanities. His research interests include music, landscape, cultural geography, ecocriticism, and environmental humanities, Scandinavian music, Grieg, Sibelius, and Nielsen, and English music, Elgar, Vaughan Williams, and Delius. He has published previous books on Edvard Grieg in 2006, Carl Nielsen in 2010, and Frederick Delius in 2018. In addition, Professor Grimley is one of the world's foremost authorities on Jean Sibelius, serving as editor of the Cambridge Companion to Sibelius in 2004, and for the widely known anthology Sibelius and His World, Princeton University Press 2011, which included essays by such experts as Glenda Goss, Tommy Mäkelä, and Timo Virtanen. He wrote the program notes for a recent 2019 recording of the Kullervo Symphony on Hyperion. He is the author of a brand new book on Sibelius, Jean Sibelius, Life, Music, and Silence, Reaction Books 2021, which I've been reading with great enjoyment. The title of Professor Grimley's lecture is Sibelius, From Firebrand to Monument. Professor Grimley.
Thank you so much, Carl. Very good morning, everybody, and good evening from here in the UK. I'm very grateful to you all and to Helena for the extremely kind invitation to be part of this FinFest series. It means a lot to me for all sorts of reasons, but most perhaps because I've been such an admirer of Maestro Vanska's work for a very long time. And I can share with you that when I was editing my very first book on Sibelius, which Carl kindly mentioned, The Cambridge Companion, I went as a keen but rather naive young scholar to Birmingham in the Midlands of England to interview Maestro Vanska. And he graciously gave me over 2 hours of his time, because once you get him talking, he just won't stop. And he was an incredible fount of wisdom and knowledge and experience. And in fact, we only had to stop our conversation because he needed to go and conduct a concert. So I really do think that he's been a remarkable force in all sorts of ways for Sibelius scholars and Sibelius enthusiasts and lovers all around the world. So I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to try and share my screen. This is always a slightly scary moment. So do bear with me. Helena, you may need to allow me to share the screen, actually.
It should work now.
Okay, so
Yes, there we go.
Okay, brilliant. That's a very that's a very good sign. Jolly good. So the title of my lecture today is, in a sense, self-explanatory, From Firebrand to Monument. It's really reflecting on Sibelius's biography and his life and times. And having just written a biography of Sibelius, as Carl mentioned, I thought this was a good moment to just talk to you about what I think the story of Sibelius's life might look like from a summative perspective, and then to give you some insights into why he developed in the way that he did. Now, my talk is going to be in two broad sections. In the first section, I will give you the briefest of overviews of Sibelius's biography and the story of Finnish nationalism with which he was so deeply interconnected. And then the second part of my talk, I'm going to give you 7 bite-sized chunks from Sibelius's life. And I've chosen 7 of them partly because he wrote 7 symphonies, also because there are 7 days in the week, and also because I think this gives us a sense of the way in which his life and career changed as the story of Finland progressed. So that's the plan of what I'm going to say. But I actually want to start almost at the end of my story, which is with the monument. This is Eila Hiltonen's famous Sibelius monument in Helsinki, originally called Credo, now simply known as the Sibelius Monument, unveiled in 1967. Some of you may well have visited this site. It's a spectacular piece of sculpture. As you can see, it consists of a series of stainless steel tubes which have textured outsides and which are hollow, so you can lie underneath the tubes if you've got enough clothes on in winter and look up and see the Finnish sky. And I've done it both in the depths of January, when you can see stars and a sort of infinite blackness, and in summer, when of course you look into that amazing Nordic blue. But it was a rather controversial design when it was first unveiled, partly because it was so abstract, and also I suspect because it was by a female sculptor, and that in itself was a rather adventurous proposition for Finnish art circles in the 1960s. Hiltonen described the piece as being inspired by Sibelius's music, and we might think of the monument as representing a series of steel organ pipes, or perhaps it represents the edge of an ice sheet of the kind which carved the pink granite on which most of Finland has been built. Or if you see it from a distance, then it looks like the shimmering lights of the aurora borealis. The way that the light catches the steel and bounces off it creates the most mesmerizing effect. As part of a response to criticism of the early design, Hiltonen did include a bust of Sibelius. Here's to one side of the monument, looking as though he appears out of a cloud of steam. Not the most successful part of the design, I think, but it reinforces the extent to which I think Sibelius's music is also strongly associated with the Finnish landscape. And that's something which I'll go on and talk a little bit more about in the rest of my lecture today. But when I was reflecting on the idea of Sibelius as a monument, well, it really takes us to the heart of that idea of Sibelius as a national hero. And that's really the story that I'm going to explain today in my lecture. So let me go on to the first bit of my talk. And this is a very broad overview of what Sibelius's career and life looked like. He was born in 1865 in a small town, Hämeenlinna, in southern central Finland on the 8th of December. 1865, that means he was born 5 years after Gustav Mahler, the great Austrian composer, and in the same year as his Danish friend and contemporary Carl Nielsen. He then went to Helsinki University in 1885, where he was initially enrolled to read law, but he was always something of a dropout student, and his family very quickly realized that his real love was in music. So he then transferred to the Helsinki Music Institute, now known, of course, as the Sibelius Academy, where he completed his undergraduate studies. And then in 1889, like so many young men of his generation, he felt he had to leave Finland, both in order to gain a wider cultural horizon and also to pursue a more postgraduate level of musical education. And he spent time in 2 really key musical cities, first of all Berlin and then Vienna. And neither of those experiences entirely happy for the young Sibelius, but I do think they are formative in the way that he developed as a composer, in ways which I'll go on and explain in a few minutes. When he returns to Finland in 1891, we know that he meets the famous runic singer Laren Paraska, and I'll explain exactly what influence Paraska's performance had on Sibelius's music in just a few moments, but we'll hear it in the strains of his Kuularho Symphony, which was premiered the following year in 1892. Then 1900 It's a really breakthrough year for Sibelius' performance of his first symphony in Paris, followed 5 years later by the first of his 5 visits to my country, to England, which outside Scandinavia and North America, especially the United States, I think was perhaps the nation which took Sibelius most directly and closely to its heart. It was a very important site for the early international reception of Sibelius music, for good and I think for bad reasons. 1911, the premiere of perhaps his most challenging piece, the Fourth Symphony, followed 3 years later by what is perhaps the highlight of his international career, the award of an honorary doctorate at Yale University and a prestigious series of performances on the East Coast of the United States. Followed a year later by his 50th birthday celebrations, marked by the premiere of his Fifth Symphony, and of course, the outbreak of the First World War, which had a serious effect on Sibelius's musical income from overseas, even though Finland itself was not directly involved in that conflict. 1924 is the premiere of his Seventh Symphony. In the 1930s, we know that he works on an Eighth Symphony, but tragically, it never appears. And then 1957, he dies on the 20th of September, aged 91, having seen some of the most tumultuous events the 20th century would bring. So an extraordinary long and varied and diverse life. But what's significant about that biography, of course, is the way that it maps onto and parallels so many of the important developments in Finland's history as an independent nation. So if we look at how Sibelius's career is aligned with that process, well, we might get a story that looks like this. So remember, of course, that in 1809, so well before Sibelius's birth, that's the year when Finland becomes a Russian Grand Duchy, having been previously part of Sweden. And the Russian presence in Finland is initially quite positive and supportive. So Russians are happy to sponsor academic research into Finnish history and literature and the arts, leading, for instance, in 1835 to the publication of the national epic, the Kalevala. In 1882, one of Sibelius's older colleagues, Martin Delius, founds the Music Institute, the first professional institute dedicated to music education in the country, where Sibelius himself would shortly study. 1889 sees the first publication of the Finnish language newspaper Päivilehti, which was to become a very important voice for the campaign for Finnish independence, leading to its closure because of political pressure in 1904. And the final decade of the 19th century is a time when those political tensions are very rapidly increasing. And Sibelius's music responds to that changing political environment. So for instance, 1893, he's commissioned to write music for an evening event ostensibly advertised as a fundraiser for the Viipuri Students Association. In fact, this was a thinly disguised campaign event for Finnish nationalists. And if we listen to the overture that Sibelius provided for that occasion, I think you can already hear his excitement behind the nationalist project. Let me see if I can just play you a little bit of this music. what I love about that piece is it's so evocative of that very particular moment in the early years of the campaign for Finnish nationalism. So we start with this sense of a kind of driving rhythm, an optimistic sense of what lies ahead. And then towards the end of that clip, you feel as though time is somehow scrolling back. And Sibelius takes us into this imaginary, archaic world of folklore and of runic singing. If you like, it gives us a history of Finland before the country had actually become a modern nation. So in that sense, he's very closely allied with this programmatic campaign for Finnish independence. But as we know, it's going to be a long and difficult struggle. The year after, the Karelia music was premiered, sees the coronation of the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II. Finlandia is premiered in 1899, again at an event which is thinly disguised as a fundraising opportunity. And Finlandia was originally entitled Suomi Herre, which means Finland Awake. So it was very deliberately a call to political action. 1904 sees the assassination of the Russian Governor General and the beginning of a campaign that's far more hardline in its approach to political censorship, leading, of course, to the Russian Revolution in 1917, Finland's brief declaration of independence at the end of that year, and then the Finnish Civil War, during which Sibelius is briefly placed under house arrest. This was an extraordinarily dangerous time for Sibelius and his family. He was explicitly associated with the right-wing nationalist side in the Civil War, whereas much of the south of the country was initially under the control of the red communist forces. And Sibelius genuinely believes that at any moment he may have been taken out and arrested or have been shot. So it was a very tense time, and one which I think had quite a profound impact on much of his later work. Those political shadows, of course, don't go away even after the Civil War has ended. In 1935, Adolf Hitler awards Sibelius the Goethe Medal, and in 1939, the Russian army attacks Finland, leading to the Winter War. By this point, though, I think Sibelius is very concerned to try and stay as distant as he can from any aspect of party politics. One of the most moving accounts we have from his diary is of him in 1943, listening to a performance of Vaughan Williams' Fifth Symphony from London on the wireless, and writing that Vaughan Williams had given him more humanity than anything he'd heard that year. And then in 1955, 2 years before Sibelius's death, Finland finally joins the United Nations as a fully fledged member of the international community. So Sibelius's life then corresponds with this remarkably tumultuous path to independence that defines the Finnish nation even today. So that gives us a broad summary, but I want now in the second part of my talk to focus on 7 particular moments which I think exemplify Sibelius's response to these historical events, and also the effect that it had on particular key works from his musical career. I want to start, though, first of all, with his childhood in Hämeenlinna. Hämeenlinna, of course, is a very small town. It's about halfway between Helsinki and Tampere. So you can go through it on a fast train and barely even notice that you've gone through the town. But it was actually a strategically very important location. As this picture from the early 19th century that I have on my slide shows in the top left-hand corner, it was dominated by an old Swedish fortress, because it was located just on the southern edge of the Finnish Lake District, with access to the ports on the south coast of Finland, just a few miles below. And it was to become an important transport hub, the site of the first railroad link in Finland, and later the site of an important Russian garrison town. And that's the reason why the Sibelius family moved to Hämeenlinna. Sibelius's father was a doctor in the Russian army, who died when Sibelius himself was only 2, as part of a typhoid epidemic that swept across Finland in the 1880s. And so I think the absence of that father figure in Sibelius's life led to Sibelius's own constant fear of his mortality, his sense that he would also suffer an early death. And I think it may also have led to many of his anxieties about money, about social status, about his dependence on much of the family around him. Indeed, many of the factors that would lead to his later addiction to cigars and alcohol, and his chronic lapses of self-confidence, which really tortured him throughout much of his professional life. But it was also in Hämeenlinna that he got his first musical experience, learning violin with a local commandant in the Russian army, Gustav Levander, and taking part in chamber music evenings with other members of the middle class society in the town. And so in a sense, it provides a musical foundation for Sibelius, on which he would then later go on and build once he became a student in Helsinki. My second moment then is the point at which I think Sibelius really marks his breakthrough as a national voice in Finnish music. And it's the premiere of his Kuulavro Symphony on the 28th of April, 1892. And the premiere took place in the Great Hall of Helsinki University, which of course is right on Senate Square in the very center of the city. And you have an image here at the top, which gives you some sense of the grandeur of the surroundings. And this was a really important national event. The soloists were two of the leading musicians of the day, the baritone Abraham Ojanperä and Emi Ahte, the mother of the famous Wagnerian opera singer Aino Ahte, with whom, of course, Sibelius would also have a creative collaboration later in his career. Now, the Kuulavro Symphony is really exceptional in Sibelius's output. He'd never write anything quite like it again. It's a grand choral symphony in 5 movements. It takes its texts from the Finnish national epic, Kalevala from Canto 35, and it's the story of a tragic hero, Kuulavro, who is an orphan who grows up with an abusive family, who then goes through the worst kind of adolescence. Essentially, he's just a bad boy on the block and ends up seducing his sister and then wreaking revenge on the foster family who betrayed him. So it's a brutal story of bloody violence and abuse, hardly the kind of topic which you would expect would attract a glittering national audience. But what's really remarkable about it is that this is the work which shows, I think, most powerfully the effect that listening to Finnish folk music had had on Sibelius's career through his encounters with Larin Paraska. Now, this comes after he'd studied in Berlin and Vienna, and paradoxically, it's while he was abroad and away from Finland that he developed that interest in Finnish folk music for the first time. And a letter to his wife Aino, he writes, this ur-Finnishness, or that sense of a kind of primal, originary Finnishness, has gotten into my, that should say, flesh and blood. I succeed best in this manner, as Finnish for me has become sacred. So he's really saying here that he's rediscovered or discovered for the first time that sense of what actually it means to be Finnish and how he can express that musically. And we're going to listen to a very short extract from the 3rd movement, which recounts the episode where Kuulavro encounters his sister and seduces her, to give you a sense of what that Finnishness in music sounds like in Sibelius's early work. So things to listen for here are, first of all, the entry of the male chorus singing in Finnish, then the use of a Kalevala-inspired folk meter. You can count the beats in this music, and if you do, you'll count 5 rather than the more normative 4. And that corresponds with one of the rhythmic patterns in the text of the Kalevala itself, and one that's often found in runic singing in Finnish folk music. Another folk characteristic is the way that the music, rather than proceeding in a kind of linear developmental way, such as we might find, for instance, with Beethoven or Brahms, or even with Wagner, the music actually is rather repetitive. It goes round and round and round in cycles, much the way, in fact, that runic singers will perform when they're recounting a canto from the Kalevala. So listen out for those characteristics just in this opening extract, and also listen just for that entry of the choir, which is one of the most spectacular moments in the whole symphony. So it's a really remarkable debut entry for such a young composer. What I find most remarkable, of course, is that Sibelius's first language was Swedish. He'd learned Finnish first at secondary school. And even while he was courting his wife-to-be, Aino, he was still trying to improve and practice his Finnish. But by the time we get to the Kulavo Symphony, his feeling for the distinctive rhythmic articulation of the language has become really intense and really powerful. And in that passage, we're being introduced to Kulavo for the first time. Was a Kulavo Kalavan Poika Sinisuka Aeon Lapsi. So essentially Kulavo, the son of Kalavo, a fine young fellow. But of course, he's going to be led to this terrible fate. And that might seem a very strange topic for a piece on this scale at such a moment in Finland's national history. But I think Sibelius's Finnish audience readily identified with that sense of oppression and abuse. And that was why the Kulavo Symphony became such a powerful national event, because it spoke of what the Finns themselves felt was their tortuous state under the yoke of Russian imperial rule. So in other senses, this was the moment at which Sibelius himself could then project his own creative vision as a future for the Finnish nation. My third moment takes Sibelius to a very different place. This is to Paris. Let me get my slide back for a second. Sorry, apologies, everyone. There we are. This is the moment at which Sibelius really becomes an international figure for the first time. So some 8 years after the premiere of Kulavo, he's readily recognized as a hero at home, but he hasn't yet established a really international presence. And the opportunity is presented by the Exposition Universelle held in Paris in 1900, which allowed various countries from right across the globe to project their cultural, political, economic aspirations on the site of a large world fair of the kind which cities in North America, such as Chicago, would also hold. Finland was able to have a presence there and was marked by a Finnish pavilion, which was designed by the young architect Elias Saarinen, who was in fact also to become one of the most important advocates for a distinctive Finnish identity in the early 20th century. And the interior of the pavilion was designed by Sibelius's friend and contemporary, the painter Akseli Gallen-Kallila. So the pavilion was there to host events, and it was accompanied by various luminaries from Finnish cultural life, including the Helsinki Orchestral Society, now the Helsinki Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by another of Sibelius's elder contemporaries, Robert Kajanas. And the Helsinki Orchestral Society gave a series of concerts in Paris, including a performance of Sibelius's first symphony, along with his King Christian suite, Swan of Tuonela and Lemminkainen's Return from Lemminkainen Legends, and Finlandia, which had to be performed under the title La Patrie, because to call it Finlandia would have been too provocative for the Russian censors. And this was an occasion at which Parisian music critics could hear Finnish music for essentially the first time, and they were bowled over by the performance of Sibelius's symphony. And this is the point at which Sibelius was then recognized internationally as the sound of contemporary Finnish music. And I want to play you one passage from the first movement of the symphony, which I think gives you a sense of exactly what must have excited French critics. This is a point at the end of the development leading into the recapitulation, so the point at which the opening of the Allegro returns. And quite simply, there's nothing quite like this in music before Sibelius, the way in which he gathers all the various threads of the music together and then sweeps you into the return of the opening subject is really something that no other composer had achieved in quite this way before. And you can imagine the Parisian music critics' ears ringing when they heard this passage for the first time. So it's a completely new sound, and that's what I think bowled over Prussian critics when they first heard it. But for Sibelius, this also created a fundamental tension between his desire to be recognized as a symphonic composer on an international scale and the need to maintain contact with his local domestic audience in Finland. And whilst in 1900 at the Exposition, that those two aims may have seemed entirely aligned and consonant, as Sibelius's career developed, they became increasingly hard to reconcile. And we can hear that in the next moment, which I've chosen, if my slide will move, which is the premiere of his Fourth Symphony on the 3rd of April, 1911. Now, the origins of this work are a hiking trip that Sibelius took to Lake Pilinen in eastern Finland with his brother-in-law, the painter Eero Järnefelt. And I've got a couple of Järnefelt's portraits of that region on my slide here. And Sibelius writes in his diary on the 3rd of October 1909, at Coley, one of the greatest impressions of my life, planning a work that he calls La Montagne. But the Fourth Symphony really captures that tension between the local and the international in Sibelius's career at its most acute. By the time that we get to 1909, 1910, European continental music has begun to move into a much more aggressively modernist phase. This is the decade of Stravinsky's great dance ballets in Paris, Firebrand, Petrushka, and ultimately The Rite of Spring, and the 12-tone works of Arnold Schoenberg. And Sibelius feels the need to be able to compete at that level as a compelling, relevant, modern voice in European music. But that means risking losing touch with his local domestic audience in Finland. And that was particularly problematic in the Fourth Symphony. This is in many ways Sibelius's most advanced and remote and inaccessible work. And many of his contemporary listeners in Finland simply found it impossible to reconcile with the sweeping national romantic figure that they'd hailed from Kulavo in 1892 through the First Symphony of 1900 and the second just a few years later. After the first performance, the music critic Heikki Klemmetti wrote, "Everything seems so strange. Transparent figures float here and there, speaking to us in a language whose meaning we cannot grasp." And I'm going to play you a passage of the kind which I think probably provoked Klemmetti's response. This is from the development section of the first movement of the Fourth Symphony, not dissimilar, in fact, to the place we've just listened to in the first movement of the First Symphony, but just how different this music is from that earlier Sibelius. So for Sibelius's Finnish listeners, that music was simply completely inaccessible, icy, remote, distant. But it also created a controversy in the weeks following the premiere. Another critic published a detailed programmatic account of the work, relating it to precisely that walking trip that Sibelius had taken to Coley with Jarnefelt 2 years previously. And Sibelius felt moved to publish a response in the newspapers, strongly denying that there was any programmatic basis for the music whatsoever, and that it was simply absolute, so it had no referential meaning whatsoever. Once again, representative, I think, of that tension in Sibelius's mind between the need to appear modern, if not modernist, and also trying to keep secret the origins or sources of his work so that it couldn't be pinned down or determined by listeners into narrow a manner. So if the Fourth Symphony represents Sibelius at his most advanced and most progressive, in a sense it also represents a high point from which he then, in some senses, steps back. My next moment is those 50th birthday celebrations in 1915, when Sibelius once again feels a need to re-engage with his national audience in order to account for himself as one of his country's great artistic heroes. And this is a photograph of him rehearsing the orchestra for the concert that was going to feature the premiere of the Fifth Symphony. Very interesting, I think, because we don't have many images of Sibelius working as a conductor. He was notoriously camera shy. And you can just about see here on the image, which has been taken from quite a long way back, that he's turned around rather awkwardly in his chair on the podium, and he'd much rather get back to the business of conducting the new symphony. The origins of this symphony are very well known. Here's a diary entry from earlier that year. He writes, "Today at 10 to 11, I saw 16 swans, one of the greatest impressions in my life. Such beauty. They circled over me for a long time, disappeared into the haze like a silver ribbon, which now and then glittered. They called it the same woodwind type as that of the cranes, but without the tremolo. The swans close to that. The trumpets were rather a sarrusophone, the refrain reminiscent of a small child's cry. Nature mysticism and life sorrow, the symphony's finale theme, the slurs in the trumpet. God, nature mysticism, romanticism, and God knows what. That this has happened to me now, an outsider for so long, had been in heaven today." And we can read an awful number of things from that quotation. One is the importance of landscape and nature to Sibelius's creative imagination. But the other, strangely, is that sense of Sibelius himself as an outsider, isolated as an artist perhaps, or isolated as a Finn working on the edge of Europe. It's hard to tell exactly what he means by that phrase, but it's one that recurs throughout his diaries and correspondence. And this is how the symphony began in that concert on the 8th of December, his 50th birthday, in Helsinki in 1915. Now, the sharp-eared amongst you may have already realized that, of course, that's not really how the Fifth Symphony begins at least not in the version that we generally hear in the concert hall. That's the original version from 1915, which Sibelius then revised twice, once the year later, and then 3 years after that, with the final version only being performed for the first time in 1919. And the differences between those different versions are absolutely fascinating. The most obvious is that, in fact, Sibelius compressed the symphony from 4 movements into the 3 that we now know in that final version. And there were all sorts of other local details which changed, some of which we heard just in those opening few bars, which give us a very detailed insight into Sibelius's working method, as well as that sense of creative self-scrutiny, which later in his life was to become almost destructive. He was a highly restless figure, constantly nervous about what people thought about his work. And I think ultimately that proves to be one of the reasons why we don't hear the Eighth Symphony. It never enters the public domain. My sixth moment, my penultimate moment, is the 1920s. This sees the premiere of Sibelius's, what was to be Sibelius's final symphony, the 7th, in March 1924, the only one of his symphonies premiered outside Finland. The first performance takes place in Stockholm, where it appears under the title Fantasia Sinfonica. Sibelius himself wasn't certain whether to call the work a symphony at all, and it's only quite late in the work's history that, in fact, he finally decided that he was going to call it a symphony and number it amongst his canon. That's followed by his music for a production of Shakespeare's Tempest, commissioned by the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen in Denmark in 1925. And I think what attracted Sibelius about that project was the idea of himself as a kind of Prospero-like figure, a creative magician or magus who is performing their own retirement from the stage. In other words, has a sense that their career or life is coming to an end and now is the moment to step back. So his Tempest music is full of strange late sounds, as well as the violent music of the storm which wrecks the ship that initiates the action on which Shakespeare's play then depends. And we have another storm at the end of his final tone poem, Tapiola, premiered by Walter Damrosch and in New York on the 26th of December 1926. The score of Tapiola is prefaced by the famous quatrain, which appears in German and in English. Widespread they stand the Northland's dusky forests, ancient, mysterious, brooding savage dreams. Within them dwells the forest's mighty god, and wood sprites in the gloom weave magic secrets. But in fact, we don't think this verse is by Sibelius himself. It was more likely to have been written by his publisher in German as an attempt to explain what Tapiola might be about. Tapiola, of course, is the Finnish forest world in Kalevala. And we have a rather different sense of the forest from one of Sibelius's friends and contemporaries, the photographer Inter Konrad Inha, in his book Suomen Maisemia, so Finnish Landscapes in 1909. He says, I had seen the forest through the eyes of a folk poem imbued with the spirit of Tapiola. I viewed it with the eyes of a toiler. I saw it as a hostile force, the foe of man and his civilization. And perhaps that's what lies behind the famous storm sequence towards the end of the tone poem, which sounds like this. So it's extraordinarily violent music. It might suggest a state of creative rage. Perhaps it reflects Sibelius's feelings about the Finnish Civil War, or about the dark clouds of war which are already beginning to gather on the horizon. Or perhaps it captures that sense of some kind of elemental natural force beyond human control, which animates the world beyond his villa at Ainola. Who knows? It's a very strange and bleak and ultimately radiant final vision. But it's not my final moment. That is to reflect on Sibelius in the 1930s and this question of exactly what happens to the Eighth Symphony and then the apparent silence which follows. One of the issues in Sibelius scholarship when we look at this decade from Sibelius's life is the extent to which his critical reception became strongly polarized between people who saw him as the successor to Beethoven, as one of the universal greats of Western civilization, and then critics such as the philosopher Theodor Adorno, who attacked Sibelius as a representative of a kind of ultra right-wing nationalism, which could lead in very dark political directions indeed. Adorno wrote a short essay on Sibelius in 1938 while he was a refugee from Nazi Germany, and indeed while he was staying at Merton College, which is my own home at the University of Oxford. And he's been provoked, I think, by a number of things. One, I think, is by the sight of the rise of fascism from which he's had to flee. Another is some of the claims being made by writers on Sibelius for the greatness of his music. And I think a third is caution or resistance to the idea of landscape and nature as somehow politically neutral sources of creative inspiration. This is what he says at one point in the essay. Sibelius is the antithesis of Stravinsky, but he has less talent. Their song, meaning the song of Sibelius' supporters, hinges on the refrain, "It's all nature, it's all nature." The great Pan yearning for blood and soil, that phrase which of course the Third Reich associated itself, swiftly presents itself. The trivial passes for the elemental, the unarticulated for the sound of unconscious creation. So it's a damning verdict, but I think it's a verdict which is directed more at the profile that Sibelius's music had come to assume in countries such as Germany, rather than with Sibelius's music itself. But what it does mean is that I think that Sibelius himself as a creative figure had begun to feel increasingly anxious and increasingly nervous about both his own position in terms of European musical style, the fact that he hadn't become a modernist figure like Stravinsky or Schoenberg, and also the kinds of political associations with which his music had begun to be gathered in Finland in the 1930s and through into the 1940s, and his own desire to distance himself from the kind of crude party politics which he felt could only lead in violent and destructive directions. So we know that he worked on an Eighth Symphony pretty much all the way through the 1930s, but some way towards the end of that decade, probably in the years around the point at which Adorno was writing his essay, he consigned the score to the stove in Ainola and burnt all of the sources. And we only have a very few fragments and sketches left from what the work might have been. So what conclusions do I think we can draw from this brief overview of Sibelius's life and career? One, I think, is the interconnection of national history and artistic biography and the sense in which they were so deeply connected for Sibelius and for Finland. The next is the way that by tracing these different strands through Sibelius's career, we are also in a sense narrating an image of Finnishness, particularly those tensions between the idea of being on the periphery, of being isolated, and the claims to authenticity which underpin much of the artistic work that Finnish artists undertook in the early years of the 20th century. It's also a story about musical symbolism, about music's social, cultural, political, and creative roles in the formation of a national society and the way it can bring together and foster and support a sense of community. It's also a story about words and music and program music, or not about words and music and program music, because of Sibelius's resistance to any kind of direct referential meaning. Rather, I think Sibelius is remarkable more for his associative imagination, the way in which he was able to cross different art forms and bring different kinds of symbols and images to bear in his creative thought with an incredible intensity. But that's also then a story about the tension between modernism, abstraction, difficulty, the kind of advanced progressive music of the Schoenberg-Stravinsky kind, versus the conservatism of the great Western symphonic tradition, to which Sibelius certainly felt he was in part an inheritor. And then Sibelius's wider role, his significance as a site of celebration and of resistance and emulation, both for his contemporaries and for those musicians and artists who had to follow him. And that leads us back then to where we started, which is that idea of Sibelius as a national monument, difficult, complex, complicated, but infinitely rewarding, and the world is the richer for his work. Thank you very much for listening. I hope we've got some times for question, so I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Professor Grimley. That was a absolutely stunning presentation. I learned a lot of new things there. And I once wrote in one of my reviews, has the last word ever been written about Sibelius, but we always find new things that are really, really interesting. I'm looking at what we have in our question box here. Not really a lot of questions, maybe mostly comments. The first I see here is maybe Americans embrace Sibelius because of the echoes of independence from a colonial power brings to mind the same thing in the United States. Could you perhaps say a few words about his role in Finnish nationalism and bringing about Finnish independence, especially that work Finlandia, which was kind of a hot brand because it was performed so many times under different titles. And I was quite curious when I had read that the score was nearly lost to Finlandia, had to be reconstructed from the parts which were available. Tell us a little more about Finlandia, because if Sibelius had his greatest hits, that was probably his greatest hit. So tell us a little about that.
Yeah, Finlandia and Vals Trist. And of course, the tragedy about Vals Trist is that he sold the rights to that to a publisher for peanuts. And if he'd held on to that, then he would have been an extremely wealthy man and he would never have had any money worries. But that's not what you asked me about, Carl. You asked me about Finlandia, and that is such a fascinating piece. So originally it forms part of actually a whole evening's worth of music to accompany a series of tableaux vivants, or sort of semi-staged theatrical performances that was designed to narrate the history of Finland from earliest times through to the modern day. And the sequence which became known as Finlandia was the final number of that evening's performance. And it was designed to suggest Finland's emergence into the modern world as a modern nation state, which of course it couldn't have done politically, at least not overtly. So there was a very strong political subtext here, which was about the right to self-determination. And in fact, in the center of the piece, on stage, the actors wheeled on a papier-mâché steam locomotive to symbolize Finland driving itself forward into this bright, independent, economically robust future. And Sibelius captures that musically. There's a sequence where you actually hear the churning gears of the locomotive. It's a kind of do, 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 bomb,
Yeah,
bomb.
that's
And
right.
you hear the kind of pistons going. And that was something which the steam locomotive arrived on stage. So it's very odd for us now because we're so familiar with Finlandia as an independent concert piece that doesn't have any specific pictorial associations, to remember that actually it was a bit like a film soundtrack. It was very closely integrated with a piece of stage action. And of course, that's why it was so powerful for its contemporary audience. Now, I think for Sibelius, that sense that he could use that national campaign, the nationalist campaign, as a creative resource was incredibly exciting, because it opened up a whole series of creative opportunities that he wouldn't have had otherwise, and it gained him an audience. And I think the enthusiasm of the audience must have been very hard to resist. But very quickly, I think he also realized that being simply a national figure actually was rather limiting, and that his real ambitions were far beyond the nation state. And we sense that almost immediately when he goes to Paris. That's why I chose Paris as my as my third moment, because it was such a key opportunity for Sibelius to meet the world's greatest artists, musicians, industrialists on a completely different level, way beyond anything he could have experienced at home in Finland. And that's really, I think, the start of that tension, which he can never really resolve, between that desire to be up to date, modern, international, but also the local boy who made good. And of course, that's a creative tension, but it's a difficult one.
Excellent answer. There's a question here from an anonymous attendee. It says, I was wondering if you read the book Sibelius, A Personal Portrait by Santeri Levas, his personal secretary from 1938 to Sibelius's death. It's a great read. I would recommend anyone interested to try to find a copy of the book. And he says, can you talk about his sixth sense that is mentioned in the book? Sounds and notes are assigned to colors by Sibelius, with his favorite being a clear green. He was quoted as saying it was somewhere between D and E flat. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, what a great question. That is a very important book. And of course, Santeri Levas was extremely close to Sibelius and would draft letters and sign documents on Sibelius's behalf. So outside his immediate family, no one knew him better. But of course, Levas wasn't a neutral commentator on Sibelius. So we also need to read the book mindful of the sense that it's written so close to its subject, it cannot be objective. And so I think we need to treat some of the claims that it makes with a little caution. And that was one of the reasons I think why Adorno was so powerfully exercised about this image of Sibelius as a great nature poet. And of course, Adorno had very good reasons to be wary of exactly those kinds of associations, given where he'd just come from in Germany in the late 1930s. But the idea of Sibelius as, well, we now might think of him as a synesthete, as someone who could understand music through color, through taste, through smell. I think that's pretty close to the truth, because it's corroborated by other accounts that we have from very different kinds of writers. And that's what I meant when I referred to Sibelius as associative imagination on my final slide. I think that is very much how he imagines the relationship between music and the world. And that's also, in fact, why he was so disturbed by the newspaper account of the Fourth Symphony as being a sort of programmatic account, a bit like Richard Strauss's Alpensymphonie, of a trip to the hills. I mean, I think Sibelius said it's not that specific at all. He associates music with images or sounds or sense, but it's really about capturing an atmosphere or a state of mind in that instant. And that's not nearly so fixed. And so I think for Sibelius, it's a way of trying to talk or capture figuratively something which is by definition very fleeting and momentary. Once you try and put your hand on it, it's gone. But of course, he's always trying to recapture that moment. And I think that's very much part of what Levas is talking about when he proposes this idea of Sibelius hearing music through color.
Yeah, fantastic. The next question that we have here is from Norm Ford from Suwannee, Minnesota. And he talks about, it seems that Sibelius encountered or experienced government claiming credit for the performance and skill of individuals in the arts, music, sports, etc., even though the person is not accepted as a full member of nation citizenship. I'm thinking about this, and I think that we could perhaps talk a little bit about Sibelius's symbolic strength as a symbol of Finland, as a symbol of Finnish independence, how he's claimed to be this strong symbolic thing, but maybe he really, as a person, wasn't that way, or as a composer. And there's an entire mythology that's created around Sibelius, that he was serious, that he walked through the woods and heard a bird sing and wrote a symphony, and those sorts of things, which were really magnified by musicologists too, and so on. And Eero Tarasti, I'm sure you know Tarasti, he wrote that this is not necessarily a bad thing, that there needs to be some great symbols for nations and to pull nations together. And Sibelius became one of those great symbols, along with the Kalevala and other symbols that we have. If you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it would take far longer than we have to deal with that adequately. I mean, I'm struck that I'm speaking to you from a small town in the English Midlands called Stratford-on-Avon, which is famous, of course, because it's the birthplace of William Shakespeare. And when I think of cultural figures who have that sort of national prominence and symbolism, you can compare with Sibelius. Shakespeare is almost the only one that springs to mind. So I think that's true. And I think what's fascinating about Sibelius's career is we can see him embrace and adopt and then step away from that national symbolic role personally, while also becoming very much an official figure who is wheeled out on political occasions. And I think because he's a performer, he plays that role consummately well. It's almost like a president or a monarch. Of course, Finland doesn't have a monarchy. And so I think he understands that is his public duty for which he's accountable. And that is a tremendous source of support and resource, but it's also absolutely crippling. I think it cripples him in terms of his personal life. He finds it financially crippling because he aspires to a grand aristocratic existence that actually he cannot really afford for much of his career. And then I think one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why we don't have any public works from the 1930s onwards is that in a sense that public symbolic role takes over from the individual creative artist. And that's a very difficult equation, but I think that's the one that Sibelius chooses to make in the context of the historical environment in which he finds himself.
Thank you. That's really good. We have a question here from Woody Woodward, who was struck by that passage you played from the Fourth Symphony. I was also struck by that, and how it said it just drew him in when he heard the Minnesota Orchestra play that. So he asks, doesn't this mysterious and non-nationalistic section, which comes back again at the end of the movement, cause more questions and wonderments of the meaning and thus help make it a masterpiece?
Yeah, I totally agree, Woody. I think that's absolutely right. And actually, the performance I chose, it's Maestro Vanska and Lahti. It's not Minnesota, but it's almost as good. And I think they play it fantastically well. Yes, it is a remarkable passage, and nobody else had dared to write anything like it in a symphony before. I mean, it's extreme in almost every sense. Actually, it reminds me of music that Sibelius would write in a later theatre score for an early modern morality play called Everyman, which is a story about an individual's journey towards salvation by renouncing their worldly goods and friends and then embracing the good deeds they've done in their life. And I think that that score is from 5 years later, and the pivotal moment in that score is a very similar passage of just sort of drifting, strange, wandering sounds. And I think this is a kind of existential state for Sibelius. It's sort of the deepest that we get into that process of what it means to be a creative artist, and the idea of out of this, you bring forth something and you're never quite sure what it's going to be. And that, of course, is the challenge and the beauty of the art form. And I think that's actually not so far distant from the kind of music that Arnold Schoenberg was writing in his Erwartung second string quartets at the same time. The Air from Another Planet could be Sibelius's.
Yeah, fantastic. And it was fascinating to me that the Fourth Symphony was criticized that way because it brought to mind that Shostakovich's Fourth Symphony was criticized, and that he severely criticized, and he wrote the Fifth Symphony, which was a response to that criticism. And I guess that Sibelius did the similar things a few years earlier.
That's right. I think that's true. I think we certainly can hear the Fifth as an artist's justified response to criticism.
Exactly.
In the same manner. And just as with Shostakovich 5, if you listen to it carefully, you can actually hear aspects of what he's done in the Fourth, just done in a different way. And you can certainly hear that in Sibelius 5, especially, I have to say, in the first version. It's an extraordinary comparison between the 1915 and 1919 scores. And there's some things in the early score which I miss from the final version. Some of the more dissonant, strange, discordant passages are really very remarkable and make us realize it's a closer piece to the Fourth than we might initially think, despite the swans.
Okay, it seems like we have a few more questions. How's our time doing, Helena? Shall we just continue on? How do you feel, Professor?
Oh yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine, as long as...
Okay, good. Okay, here's a question. When Sibelius received his honorary degree from Yale, did he conduct concerts? If so, where? For example, would the Finnish immigrants in the Boston area have had a chance to hear him conduct in person?
Oh yes, absolutely. He conducted at the Norfolk Music Festival. So if you know that, it's a very beautiful spot, a big old sort of rustic style, but rather opulent music shed built by a businessman called Carl Sturkel, who'd been a major philanthropist and patron of the arts in the Northeast. And Sibelius also rehearsed an orchestra in New York. So there's a very good chance for expat Finns in New England, down the coast, to hear Sibelius conduct. And there was enormous interest in the local media about the great Finnish hero, just as there was also enormous interest back home in Finland that one of theirs had been honored with this remarkable token of admiration from a major US university. So I think there was a tremendous excitement on both sides of the Atlantic around this. Sibelius, of course, wrote a new tone poem for that occasion, the Oceanides. He sketched it before he got on the ocean liner and then revised it substantially for first performance, having sent the first version over to Yale. So if you go to the Beinecke Library in Yale University, you can see the first version of the Oceanides, Alotarat. It's very different from the final version that we know now. Again, another good example, I think, of Sibelius, the self-critic, constantly going back over what he's done and rewriting it until he gets it in the shape in which he's more or less satisfied with it. And I think one of the tragedies, one of the many tragedies of the First World War is that had it not broken out, Sibelius would certainly have come back to the United States. And I think there would have been a very different career trajectory had that opportunity been available to him. Of course, we'll never know.
I'll follow up with that. I've always heard that Sibelius was offered the first chancellorship at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York. Is that true or not?
That's true. And he very seriously thought about it, but in the end just felt that he couldn't move his family. And that's what it would have taken. So he recommended Selim Palmgren instead, one of his contemporaries. So there was a very strong Finnish link. But he was notoriously difficult to prize out of Ainola by the time that we get to the 1910s, 1920s. I think that he knew deep down that he relied on that very strong domestic base. And of course, it wasn't just his own family. He had the in-laws very closely gathered around him. Ainola was part of an artist's colony on the edge of the lake at Järvenpää. So I think that he was really embedded in that creative environment in ways that ultimately he couldn't separate himself from.
Yeah, thank you very much. Marianne Varglin, who is the president of FinFest USA.
Hi, Marianne.
Question. Sibelius wrote vocal music, not just for the male chorus, integral to Kullervo. Please speak to this aspect of his compositional output.
Oh goodness, what a great question! And I love the choral music very deeply, and I'd love to have been able to play more of it. Actually, it's like I love the songs too, and the piano music. So there's so much that I could have talked about. And actually, I think one of the things I like to try and stress about Sibelius is just how diverse and wide-ranging his output was. He's not just an orchestral composer. So I think what's interesting about Sibelius's writing for chorus is both the way in which it really responded to the growth and development of choral societies as an institution in Finland, and they became hugely important as part of the artistic communal fabric of this new nation. So it's not simply the sound of Sibelius's music, it's also about the act of performing it with your fellow Finns that was really important. And I think that collective sense of we are building a nation through these communal acts of performance is absolutely central to what he's doing with those vocal works. And many of the texts, of course, also are drawn from Kalevala or from Finnish poets, especially Runeberg. So it's part of very consciously building a sort of national cultural capital on which the new nation can then draw. It's also a part of his output that was very influential on many of his younger contemporaries. I'm thinking especially of composers like Toivo Kuula or Levi Määrätoja, who studied with Sibelius and then write their own choral works, often in a very beautiful individual style. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Määrätoja's music, and I'd love to hear more of that performed. And his writing for chorus has a very particular feeling for Finnish language and symbolism, and also very distinctive harmonic coloring, which I think is different from Sibelius's. So in a sense, just as Sibelius shapes the sound of Finnish music symphonically, he also does it through his choral writing. And of course, that has that really important social function as well. So I don't know if that answers Marianne's question. There's lots more to say, of course.
Oh, yes, there always is. How's our time, Helena?
I think we should take maybe 2 questions still and then move on.
Okay, since I'm moderating, I'm going to be a little selfish and jump in with my own question. You mentioned Theodor Adorno's article from 1938, which has been such a great controversy in Sibelius studies. And it caused, then there was Timothy Jackson's book. And of course, that controversy was so heated that it made the pages of the Chronicle of Higher Education in the United States, saying in effect that because Sibelius accepted royalties and the Goethe Prize during the time when Hitler was in power in Germany, that he had Nazi leanings. Of course, Finnish musicologists have debunked that. What is your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, it's an extremely difficult topic, and I think the first thing to say is let us hope that none of us ever find ourselves in that kind of situation where you have to choose between the Nazis on the one hand and the Red Army on the other. I think it's a terrible, terrible historical position to find yourself in, and Finns suffered far more grievously than Sibelius ever did.
Yeah,
I think this is also an instance of the difficulties of documentary historical scholarship.
exactly
So,
right.
I think what's tricky here is knowing to what extent Sibelius himself was an agent in that process. So looking at some of the letters that Jackson cites, and I should say, I mean, I think Jackson is entirely right to ask these questions, and it's very important that we do. But then we also need to look very closely at the documents that he offers as evidence to support his argument. And I think the difficulty there is it's not always clear who's drafted the letter, who's approved it. And we also need to be aware of who the audience of that correspondence is. So I think some of the statements are political expedients. I think some are written by members of Sibelius' family who did hold quite far right-wing views, but not the composer himself. I think the question of accepting royalties, Sibelius was very concerned about his financial income because of how much money he'd lost during the First World War. And this is before copyright legislation had become really widely enforced across the globe. I think he is at worst guilty of self-interest. that he sought to be able to provide for his family. I think he was keen to remove himself from any party political context in the 30s and 40s, partly because of his experiences during the Civil War. And also, I mean, the few statements we do have, which I think are unequivocally his opinion, suggest that he found the racism of the Nazis extremely disdainful.
Yeah,
And
thank you so much for touching that. I knew that would be a difficult topic to broach, but that answers Joe's question about Sibelius being financially successful and so on there. Well, I have a final question here that that is asked by Kathleen Henny. She said, do you think the world will ever again see such a creative genius, meaning a nationalistic genius that can influence nations, because we've become so homogenized nowadays that so many international things? What do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I suppose in one sense, I'd say I hope so, and I don't see why not. Despite the homogenization, I think the world's talent is only growing. I think it will come from an unexpected place. But I think I would also say that what Sibelius did was enable Finland to become one of the most brilliant musical nations on earth. And that one of the great stories of the late 20th century musically is just how extraordinary Finland has been. And now most orchestras seem to have Finnish conductors. The standard performance in Finland is extraordinary. The Finnish music education system is remarkable. That is a testament to, I think, the genius of Sibelius. And I think it's produced many more geniuses in a country which is the size of Wales. I mean, for us, it's just an incredible story. So I think we shouldn't worry about will there be another Sibelius. Let's be thankful that there was a Sibelius, and let's embrace what the world will bring.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Grimley. This is an excellent, illuminating, insightful presentation, and it allows us a deeper look into Sibelius's work. Thank you, Professor Rahkonen, for moderating, and thank you, Minnesota Orchestra, for promoting the event, and thank you, Sam Houston State University, which is my university, for partnering with FinFest USA to provide the framework for this event. Again, the recording will be posted on the FinFest's website, and we'll also try to include a source of resources. Here's one of the most recent ones. This is Professor Grimley's most recent 2021 book. I included the bibliographic information in the chat. So by all means, this is also a very smooth read. So it reads extremely well, and it's just great. So thank you, audience, for participating, because without you, we wouldn't have an event. And see you next Saturday with more on Sibelius. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend. Thank you to everybody. Bye-bye.